Kai stood near the edge of the cavern, his breathing finally returning to normal. At first, all he registered was relief. Pain had a way of making time meaningless, in that it seemed to somehow stretch on forever, while also passing in an incoherent blur. But then, when he looked up and beheld the scene in front of him, he was suddenly gripped with fear. He didn't fear that the changed Freya in front of him would hurt him. Logically, he knew he should be afraid of that. The kind of power she was exuding often caused collateral damage that could easily include him. However, at the time, that seemed like a distant concern, almost as if it were happening to someone else. The fear he felt was that something was wrong with Freya, and that if she continued down this path, the Escalade he'd come to know in his brief time with her would be changed into something no longer human. Overcoming the instincts that told him to run or hide, he reached out and grabbed hold of Freya's shoulder before speaking to her. "That's enough, Freya. Let him go." Instantly, an eerie silence settled in the cavern. The man Freya was holding was unconscious, having passed out from panic not long ago, and Freya stood motionless. At first, the only apparent movement was the shadows that moved and danced from the firelight of her wings, and in the stillness of that moment, he noticed subtle changes on her face, even from over her shoulder. For one thing, her ears were longer and pointed, and it seemed like her jawline was different. And while it might have been a trick of the light, caused by her fiery wings, he could swear her skin was now pale, almost white. Something was wrong with her, and while he didn't know what, he knew that if he let her give in to it now, the woman he knew as Freya would be gone forever. Shoving down the last vestige of self-preservation, he continued to hold her shoulder, waiting for a response. After a moment, Freya finally spoke, but her voice sounded odd, even though she whispered, and her words sounded a little off, as if something in her mouth wasn't quite the proper shape. She sounded surprisingly small and vulnerable in that moment. "Are you afraid of me now?" Kai couldn't help it. The sheer contradiction between who she'd been a moment ago and who she was now, despite nothing physically changing, made him chuckle. Freya finally dropped the man she'd been holding, and he could feel her tense to run, but he gripped her shoulder tighter as he eventually got a hold of himself and answered, "No, I'm not afraid of you. At least no more than I already was. But I think you owe me an explanation after everything." The fiery wings on her back burst into countless motes of light that dimmed and faded, plunging them back into the cavern's gloom, and he could feel her shoulders sag, and she all but sighed. "Yes, I do, but not here, not now. I'll talk to you later." Kai sighed, partially in relief, partially in frustration. "All right, I suppose I'll have to accept that, so long as you're not lying to me, and you actually come talk later." There was something heavy, almost urgent, in her voice as she answered, "I would never lie to you. I can't swim. I'll see you later." Then there was a familiar breeze, and she was gone. He noticed the bodies of the party that had attacked him were gone too. A part of him wondered if they'd survived. He wasn't one forever to cry over their graves after what they'd tried to do to his party, not to mention what they'd actually done to him. Nor was he so naive to think Freya had made it to her position among the Escalade without having to kill a few people along the way. He'd always known that some people were willing to kill to advance themselves within the tower, and now he had first-hand experience proving just that. However, he could tell Freya had been close to falling into an abyss far darker than he could understand, and it had been imperative to pull her back from that edge. Looking around, he realized that in all the excitement, he'd gotten totally turned around and had no idea how to get out of here. So he was just trying to decide whether to sit and wait or pick a random direction gangs, when he heard a familiar, friendly voice. "Bro, where are you, bro?" Shouting out into the darkness, he yelled back to Darian, "Hey, I'm over here." A moment later, Darian came running up, still carrying Lilith, as though not realizing he was still holding her, although he was more surprised that she was still allowing him to carry. However, he didn't have time to worry about that, as they ran over to him with Bellatrix and Nyx in tow. Darian frowned at him. "Not cool, bro. Not cool at all." Then he looked around in bewilderment. "Hey, what happened to those guys who were chasing us anyway?" He shrugged before answering, Freya came and grabbed them just like I'd planned. Darian turned back to him with a grin. Dude, she's totally got the hots for you. Kai rolled his eyes. It's not like that. Why do you keep? Then he paused. Realizing that someone was missing, he added, Hey, where's Elise? A moment later, Elise stood up from a hiding spot she'd had nearby. Ah, I'm right here. I was just a little stunned by Freya when she showed up. That's all. He raised an eyebrow as he considered the situation. Elise had probably seen everything, but if she didn't bring it up now, it seemed unlikely she'd go around blabbing. Of course, a part of that is probably sheer terror, which was understandable, but he made a mental note to speak with her privately sometime later. For now, he was just glad they were all alive. With a deep breath born of intense exhaustion, he turned to the group. Hey, let's head back. Darian nodded, then looked down, seeming to realize he was holding Lilith for the first time as he grinned. Well, I guess you got it from here. He set the warlock back on her feet. Maybe it was just his imagination, but for the briefest moment, he could swear he saw her resent being freed. And spare entering. Partway back, they got a notice to return via their NWs. They were one of the later groups to get back, but not quite the last. In the last group to arrive, he saw the water and ice mage from when they got their classes. He waved a greeting, and she waved back, but then Freya called for everyone's attention. He was a little shocked to see her here after everything that happened, but she seemed determined to at least do her job as a teacher. She motioned for everyone to calm down, and got silence right away. After a moment, she addressed everyone. Congratulations to everyone. You've all come back from your first excursion into the tower alive and well. There was a cheer and some excited babble, but after a moment, Freya held up a grey hand, and got silence once again. She looked around at her class, and suddenly her gaze seemed a little sharper. However, I couldn't help but notice some of you took more advantage of this opportunity than others. To that end, I've put together a little ranking. She paused, then started off by shouting a name out. Thomas, your team killed 56 goblins. He wasn't sure how many they'd killed, but that number definitely sounded low to him. Freya continued, naming one group after another. Al-Sintar, your team killed 64. Luis, your team killed 77. Eric, your team killed 94. May, your team killed 117. He was starting to wonder just how many they killed. It had been a bit of a blur, but he didn't have to wait long as his name was spoken. Kai, your team killed 287. There were several surprised exclamations. There was such a wide gap between them and the next team down that people didn't seem to believe it. He was starting to feel a little smug, but Freya ended that with her next words. Lysaria, your team killed 312. Like everyone else, he looked around to see who this Lysaria was, only to see the water frost mage preening under the attention her team was suddenly getting. He bit down his disappointment at not being the highest and gave her a respectful nod, acknowledging her win. She nodded back, seeming to recognize that their two teams would likely be competing for the top spot for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, Nyx was pouting. Huck then moles. Our souls trying to kill us. We probably could have beaten them. Darian shrugged, as unperturbed as ever. So we beat them next time. That's how these things go. Freya called for attention one more time and offered a few final thoughts. The tower is a dangerous place, and it is all too easy to lose your lives in there. However, what you put in is what you'll get out. If all you do is play it cautious, you can make a living farming the middle layers. But for those of you who wish to be in an ascension party, you must learn to take risks and push yourselves to grow stronger. Levels alone are not enough. Stats and skills will not win you boss fights. You need to be brave. You need to be smart. And most of all, you need to be hungry for the win. She looked around at them all before finishing up. Class dismissed. People walked away in groups. Some were excited, others angry or annoyed, but he pushed against the flow, trying to get to Freya. He wanted to see when and where they could talk. Their eyes met briefly, then in a blur of motion, she was gone. He stood there for a moment, stunned. A part of him wondered whether she would go back on her word, but then he sighed. Maybe he was getting a little full of himself with all the attention she'd been giving him. Either she'd speak with him, or she wouldn't. It's not like he could force Dame Freya to do anything she didn't want to. A moment later, Darian was at his side, his signature grin plastered on his face. "Hey, Kai, we're going to go out and eat to celebrate getting out of there alive. Wanna come with?" He considered the possibility of Freya waiting for him at home, but decided it was unlikely. After all, she'd seemed a little off after everything went down. She probably needed some eftertov, sign and all. She read it, isn't it? On off and water